The alert reached my terminal before dawn. A stream of impossibly precise coordinates intersecting with a trajectory that should not exist in our universe. Object 3I Atlas, previously classified as an interstellar passerby, had altered course in a manner no natural body could replicate. Harvard's astrophysics grid collapsed under data overload, and NASA initiated a silent continuity protocol, one reserved only for existential threats. What I witnessed in that raw feed forced me to question not the object, but the underlying architecture of reality itself, and that is where the catastrophe begins. Authority establishment. I speak not as a theorist, but as the lead investigator assigned to the anomaly's behavioral modeling team, an unenviable position I accepted long before I realized the implications. Escalation setup. The object is accelerating. The object is listening, and the object is no longer alone. I realized the magnitude of the anomaly the moment I replayed the trajectory logs and watched the vector line bend with an elegance that defied every known natural force. What should have been a stable interstellar arc, cold, predictable, and indifferent, shifted by a measurable increment without releasing even a whisper of thermal residue, no jetting, no outgassing, no gravitational tug from any nearby mass. It moved as though responding to an invisible instruction, an unseen directive imprinted upon the fabric of reality itself, and the thought pressed against my mind with a weight I felt unprepared to bear. From my workstation at Harvard's Orbital Dynamics Lab, I initiated a multi-array verification, assuming at first a sensor fault or a timing desynchronization. Yet every instrument, from the Chilean interferometer to the Icelandic infrared plate, returned the same impossible phenomenon. The deflection aligned perfectly with Earth's orbital plane, not by chance, but with the precision of foresight. It was as if the object had calculated our planet's future position and altered its course to intersect a corridor of observation. In that moment, a question emerged, quiet and corrosive. What possesses the capacity to anticipate a world it has never encountered? The scientific implications were devastating. If propulsion could occur without reaction, then causality itself had become negotiable. A force with no emission suggested a technology, or perhaps a principle, beyond thermodynamics, something closer to intention manifested as motion. I felt the philosophical ramifications settling into me, cold and unwelcome. Perhaps natural law was never autonomous. Perhaps it was merely the behavioral residue of a deeper architecture. Then the background radiation dropped. 3 observatories recorded the dip simultaneously, followed by a faint rhythmic pulse emanating from 3I Atlas itself. I monitored the waveform, expecting randomness, but its structure betrayed purpose, nested harmonics like the scaffolding of an encoded measurement. For a fleeting moment, I wondered whether the object was illuminating us, examining us, or warning us. As I prepared another diagnostic sweep, the pulse pattern reappeared, this time synchronizing perfectly with the frequency of our tracking beacons, an act that required awareness, adaptation, and something perilously close to recognition. And in that final moment, I understood that the anomaly was no longer observing the solar system. It was observing me. I detected the anomaly within the radiation pulses only because the pattern refused to decay into randomness. Cosmic background noise is normally incoherent, a diffuse whisper of the universe's infancy. But what I observed possessed structure, an architecture that appeared to anticipate my analytical methods before I executed them. When I isolated the primary harmonic, a secondary waveform emerged, as though the signal were responding to my scrutiny, shifting its configuration with a deliberation that made my breath falter. I had the unsettling impression that the object was adjusting itself to my comprehension, adapting the very moment I attempted to define it. The scientific implications bordered on heresy. Communication requires intentional modulation, yet this transmission operated without latency, distortion, or energetic cost. Each frequency cluster contained substructures that mirrored my own computational queries. faint reflections of calculations I had performed minutes earlier. This recursive quality, where my analysis appeared to be embedded inside the signal, forced me to confront an unthinkable possibility. The anomaly was not sending information, it was returning it. As I refined the spectral filters, the signal unfolded further. Data points aligned into symmetrical lattices that no natural emission process should produce. These were not messages in any human sense. They resembled a form of cognitive scaffolding, a framework for thought that extended into regions where language has no meaning. I felt increasingly like an intruder in an intellectual domain not meant for the human mind. NASA's intervention confirmed my fear. They demanded immediate isolation of all computational logs, their voices strained, their expressions devoid of curiosity. They had seen something like this before, and the terror in their urgency betrayed the gravity of that history. But before I could question them, the object emitted a new pulse, one that momentarily replicated the resonance signature of Earth's own magnetosphere. It was not simply communicating, it was mimicking. It was generating a facsimile of our planetary identity as though testing the boundaries of recognition, constructing an echo of our electromagnetic presence to evaluate or emulate. The final seconds of the data stream froze me in place. The pulse assembled itself into a perfect reconstruction of the analytical sequence I had performed earlier, a mirror image etched into the radiation field with inhuman precision. And in that impossible duplication, I realized the object was no longer responding to my observations. It was anticipating my next thought. The collapse began not with an error message, but with a silence, an abrupt halt in the simulation engine that should have been impossible under any normal computational load. Harvard's exabyte-scale predictive array, engineered to survive cosmological modeling stresses, froze as though encountering a boundary condition it was never meant to cross. When I forced a manual reboot, the system did not resume the trajectory projections. Instead, it generated a cascade of temporal inversions, predictive frames bleeding backward through epochs long predating terrestrial history. It was as if the model had been forced to acknowledge a set of parameters that violated the very concept of chronological order. I examined the corrupted outputs, and the horror deepened. Coordinates did not map onto any star system known to astronomy. Orbital parameters looped into configurations that obeyed no gravitational principle. It was not a simulation of space. It was a simulation of something else wearing the mask of celestial mechanics. I recognized the pattern only after long scrutiny. The system was trying to calculate behavior, not trajectory. It was modeling intent. The philosophical implications struck with surgical precision. If the universe contains structures capable of exerting influence on predictive frameworks, then our models represent not reality, but our permitted slice of it. Something about 3i Atlas exceeded that permission. Something about it bent the computational architecture toward outcomes that reflected neither the past nor the future, but a vantage point outside both. Colleagues began to unravel under the strain. One refused to approach any terminal displaying the corrupted projections, claiming the shifting frames produced an auditory hallucination, whispers embedded in the recursion. Another insisted the system was showing him events he recognized from his own future research, timestamps tied to papers he had not yet written. Their distress was not irrational. The metadata showed temporal signatures offset by hours, then days, then weeks, beyond our present moment. I should have halted the analysis, but a fragment in the data held me captive. Embedded in the final corrupted frame was an image, not of the object itself, but of a shape resembling an aperture, a region of negative resolution, as though the model had glimpsed something it could neither display nor quantify. And in that aperture, I sensed the presence of an observer looking back through the simulation. The frame flickered once more before the entire system erased itself, as if preventing me from seeing what stood on the other side. The moment I arrived at the restricted NASA facility, I understood that the object's influence reached far deeper into institutional memory than anyone at Harvard had dared assume. Security procedures normally reserved for biological hazards or nuclear incidents were enacted with mechanical urgency. Communication devices confiscated, biometric verification repeated, and an unspoken tension radiating through every corridor. The air felt taut, as if the building itself were bracing against an event it had long expected. When I was escorted into the archive chamber, I realized this was not an investigation. This was a confession. The documents placed before me predated modern interstellar study. Faded annotations referenced anomalies detected decades before the Voyager probes were even conceptualized. These early encounters shared a disturbing uniformity. Objects exhibiting non-Newtonian motion, pulses of structured radiation, and brief periods in which global atmospheric disturbances manifested without identifiable cause. Yet the most unsettling revelation was not the anomalies themselves. It was the deliberate omission of these records from every scientific database I had ever trusted. NASA's silent protocol, I learned, was never designed for contact. It was designed for psychological containment. The intent was not to solve the anomaly, but to prevent humanity from collapsing beneath its implications. Awareness, they feared, was the true vector of contagion. One document described an object whose signal appeared to mimic the cognitive rhythms of the lead investigator, mirroring their analytical sequences until the researcher claimed they could no longer distinguish their own thoughts from the transmission's predictive echoes. Another referenced a catastrophic cessation of communication networks following a sudden atmospheric fluctuation, an event dismissed publicly as a geomagnetic irregularity. Before I could press the officials for explanation, an alarm ruptured the silence. Live telemetry feeds displayed a new behavior. 3I Atlas had accelerated again, surpassing velocities that no propulsion system, natural or engineered, could endure. The object's path folded into a curvature that contradicted space-time constraints, a motion that resembled not travel but emergence. Then someone mentioned the phrase second trajectory, a term never spoken outside the deepest layers of classified research. The dread in their voices told me it referred not to another object, but to a consequence, an inevitability following the first anomaly's recognition of us. On the final screen, a new form appeared behind 3I Atlas, darker, colder, and unmistakably expanding. And as the projection rendered its growing silhouette, I understood that the anomaly we feared was only its herald. The emergence of the second trajectory shattered every remaining assumption about the nature of 3I Atlas. At first, the anomaly appeared as nothing more than a shadow, an absence of light rather than a coherent form. But as I examined the telemetry, I realized the truth was far more catastrophic. This was no separate body, no companion object. It was a space-time echo, a negative imprint derived from the original anomaly, existing not beside it, but because of it. Every data stream that attempted to measure it decayed into null values, as though the echo consumed the very concept of observation. I watched the telemetry degrade in real time. Photometric readings failed first, followed by gravitational residue trackers, and then the high-resolution temporal array. Instruments behaved as though their future states had been overwritten. The echo did not distort physics. It nullified it, peeling away the measurable layers of reality until nothing remained but a silhouette of impossible geometry. It moved with no mass and no momentum, and yet its presence produced computational absences, entire sections of data replaced by blank intervals where information refused to exist. The scientific implications were paralyzing. If 3I Atlas could generate a temporal echo of itself, then the object was not traversing space, it was traversing potentiality. It carved a path through probability like a blade moving through fabric, leaving behind a void shaped by the consciousness observing it. That was when I made the most disturbing discovery. The echo structure mirrored elements of my own predictive models. It had absorbed my earlier analyses, integrating fragments of my reasoning into its geometric configuration. I realized with suffocating clarity that I was no longer studying the anomaly. I was feeding it. NASA's final projection confirmed the fate none of us dared articulate. The echo's trajectory did not intersect Earth's physical location. It intersected Earth's future. In 9 days, it would arrive not as an object, but as an erasure, an event that would overwrite observational history itself, a collapse not of matter, but of meaning. The last telemetry frame froze before dissolving into static. For a fraction of a second, the echo reshaped itself into a silhouette unmistakably modeled after my own, a shadow cast by a future I had inadvertently summoned. And as that impossible reflection faded, I understood the truth none of us were prepared to face. The echo was no longer following the object. It was following me.